In the early 20th century, the daughter of a prominent family was expected to be like a porcelain doll, beautiful, silent, and fragile. Her role was to attend balls, smile charmingly, and marry well. Causing a scandal was unthinkable. But President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter was no porcelain doll. Alice Roosevelt was a storm. Instead of learning embroidery, she smoked cigarettes on the roof of the White House. Instead of keeping puppies, she brought a pet snake named Emily Spinach to parties. And instead of moving gracefully, she drove through the streets of Washington, breaking every rule in her path. The press called her Princess Alice, but her father called her a nightmare, with her famous catchphrase, "If you have nothing nice to say about someone, come sit next to me." She turned scandal into an art form. But this rebellion is more than just for fun. It hides a deeper tragedy, a story of abandonment, a loveless marriage, and a secret that could destroy everything. This is the true story of Alice Roosevelt. To understand the hurricane that was Alice, you must first understand the suffocating stillness of the world she was born into. The year was 1884, the height of America's Gilded Age. It was an era of breathtaking contradictions. Industrial titans like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers were building palaces they called cottages in Newport and New York, their fortunes ballooning to sizes never before seen in human history. Yet just a few blocks away from their Fifth Avenue mansions, grinding poverty defined the lives of millions in crowded tenements. Society, especially high society, was governed by a rigid, unspoken code, a set of Victorian ideals that felt as solid and unchangeable as the brownstone buildings lining the city streets. For women, this code was particularly constricting. A lady's purpose was singular: to marry well, manage a household, and produce heirs. She was expected to be the angel in the house, pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. Her opinions were to be kept private, her ambitions non-existent. Her body was cinched into painful corsets, her movements restricted by layers of petticoats. To be loud, to be independent, to smoke a cigarette, or to voice a political opinion was to risk social ruin. Into this world of delicate teacups and whispered conversations, Alice Lee Roosevelt was born. She was the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, a charismatic, asthmatic, and fiercely ambitious young New York assemblyman from a distinguished old money family. Her mother, for whom she was named, was Alice Hathaway Lee, a stunningly beautiful and universally adored Boston Brahmin. Theodore was utterly besotted with his wife. He called her Sunshine and filled his diaries with passionate declarations of love. In one entry he wrote, "I do not think ever a man loved a woman more than I love her." They were the golden couple, destined for a life of privilege and influence. Their first child, a daughter, was to be the crowning jewel of their perfect life. But fate, in its cruelest form, intervened. The story of Alice's life begins not with a celebration, but with a catastrophe. On February 12, 1884, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt gave birth to a healthy baby girl, but the joy was immediately eclipsed by terror. The delivery had masked the symptoms of a severe, undiagnosed kidney ailment, Bright's disease. Within hours, the young mother was critically ill. At the very same time, in the same house at 6 West 57th Street, Theodore's own mother, Martha Mitty Roosevelt, was in the final stages of a battle with typhoid fever. What happened next is the stuff of nightmares. For 2 days, as a blizzard raged outside, Theodore Roosevelt raced between 2 deathbeds. He would sit with his dying mother holding her hand, then rush to his wife's room, where she drifted in and out of consciousness, barely recognizing him. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, his mother passed away. Just hours later that afternoon, his beloved wife, only 22 years old, followed her. In a single day, the vibrant, ambitious world of Theodore Roosevelt was reduced to ash. He took his diary, and on the page for February 14th, he drew a large black X and wrote a single, heartbreaking sentence beneath it. "The light has gone out of my life." For him, the infant daughter who had survived was not a comfort, but a living, breathing, agonizing reminder of the woman he had lost. He could not bring himself to say her name. He referred to her only as Baby Lee. He never spoke of his first wife again, not even to their daughter. He scrubbed her from his life, and in doing so, he emotionally erased the child she had left behind. Consumed by a grief so profound it threatened to destroy him, Roosevelt did what many men of his time did when faced with unbearable emotion. He ran. He fled west to the raw, untamed landscape of the Dakota Badlands, seeking to physically exhaust his sorrow by becoming a cattle rancher and a cowboy. And the baby? He handed her over to his older sister, Anna, affectionately known as Bamie. For the first 3 years of her life, Alice was raised by her aunt. Bamie was a loving and capable guardian, a woman of great intelligence and warmth who provided a stable home for the little girl. But it was a home without a father, and Alice knew it. She was a visitor in her own life, a child in exile from her father's heart. When Theodore returned from the West, he was a changed man, hardened, weathered, and ready to re-enter the world. In 1886, he married his childhood sweetheart Edith Caro and brought Alice back into his home. But it was no fairy tale reunion. Edith was a reserved and proper woman, determined to be a good mother to her husband's child, but a palpable distance always remained. She soon gave birth to 5 children of her own: Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel, Archibald, and Quentin. The Roosevelt household became a boisterous, chaotic, and loving place for everyone, it seemed, except Alice. She was the odd one out, the living ghost of her father's first love, a constant, unspoken reminder of a past he had tried to bury. This deep, primal wound of abandonment became the engine of her personality. If she couldn't win her father's love through obedience and affection, she would command his attention through defiance. She learned that negative attention, a frustrated sigh, or an angry outburst from her powerful father was infinitely better than the cold indifference she feared most. She became a holy terror. She argued with her stepmother, tormented her younger half-siblings, and systematically broke every rule set for her. She was fiercely intelligent, but she used that intelligence to find loopholes, to make witty but cutting remarks, and to run circles around her governesses. Her father was both exasperated and on some level secretly impressed. He saw his own rebellious spirit mirrored in her, but he didn't know how to handle it, how to bridge the emotional chasm that had been created on that terrible Valentine's Day. He could manage a cattle drive, charge up San Juan Hill, and negotiate with world leaders, but he was utterly powerless against the will of his firstborn daughter. He once wrote that he worried Alice had a sleek, yellow-haired, serpent-like quality. It was a harsh judgment, but it captured the truth. Alice had learned very early that to survive in a world that had dealt her a cruel hand, she would need fangs, a clever mind, and a will of iron. The stage was now set. That twist of fate would arrive sooner and more violently than anyone could have predicted. It came not on a ballot, but from the barrel of an assassin's gun, an event that would not only change the course of American history, but would provide Alice the grandest stage imaginable for her rebellion. In September of 1901, the nation was plunged into shock. President William McKinley, while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, was shot by an anarchist. For 8 days, America held its breath, but hope faded. McKinley died, and by constitutional succession, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, became the 26th president of the United States. At just 42 years old, he was the youngest man to ever hold the office. For the Roosevelt family, the change was sudden and seismic. Overnight, they were thrust from the relative privacy of the vice president's family into the absolute apex of American power. And for Theodore's 17-year-old daughter, Alice, it was the moment the cage that had long contained her was finally shattered. She was no longer just a defiant New York socialite. She was about to become a national phenomenon. She was about to become Princess Alice. When the Roosevelts moved into the executive mansion, which Theodore himself would officially rename the White House, Alice saw it not as a hallowed historical residence, but as a stage built just for her. She had spent her entire childhood competing for attention in a crowded family, always feeling like a star waiting for her play to begin. Now she had the grandest stage in the world. In the winter of 1902, Washington society prepared for Alice's official debut. It wasn't merely a party, it was an American royal occasion. Hundreds of guests, including foreign diplomats, senators, Supreme Court justices, and the nation's wealthiest industrialists, flooded into the White House. Alice appeared at the top of the grand staircase, and the room fell silent. She wore a stunning ball gown of shimmering pale blue silk, a color that would henceforth become immortalized as Alice Blue. With her hair piled high, her piercing blue eyes sparkling, and a smile that was equal parts sweet and mischievous, she captivated everyone. The press went into a frenzy. They called her Alice the Wonderful. In a single night, she became the most famous woman in America, a symbol of youth, beauty, and the new vibrant energy her father had brought to the presidency. But Washington would soon learn a crucial lesson. This princess was not from a fairy tale. She was from a tragedy, and she carried with her a rebellious fire that would set the capital's social rulebook ablaze. The expectations for a first daughter at the time were clear. She was to be graceful, demure, and a paragon of feminine virtue. Alice read that job description and, figuratively, tossed it into the fire. She decided to rewrite the rules, or better yet, to have no rules at all. Her first and perhaps most notorious public scandal revolved around something small and white, the cigarette. Now it's difficult in our modern world to overstate just how utterly shocking it was for a young, upper-class woman to smoke in the early 1900s. This wasn't a simple breach of etiquette. It was a declaration of war on social norms. At the time, cigarettes were becoming subtly linked with the burgeoning women's suffrage movement, a torch of freedom, as one clever advertising campaign would later call it. For a woman to smoke was to align herself in the public mind with the most radical fringes of society, the actresses, the artists, the bohemian radicals, and in the darkest corners of the Victorian imagination, the prostitutes. A lady, a woman of good breeding, simply did not do it. Alice, of course, did it with an unconcealed and theatrical glee. President Roosevelt, a man deeply conscious of his public image and the dignity of his office, was mortified. He saw his daughter smoking not as a political statement, but as a personal embarrassment. He sat her down and laid down the law with presidential authority. She was strictly forbidden from smoking under his roof. It was a command meant to end the discussion. But for Alice, with her innate lawyer's mind, it was merely the opening of a negotiation. The roof, she reasoned, was not under the roof. So, in a legendary act of defiance, she would frequently climb out of her second-story bedroom window, find a comfortable spot on the White House portico, and light up, savoring both the nicotine and the delicious irony that she was obeying the literal word of her father's command while utterly defying its spirit. Reporters with their bulky box cameras would gather like vultures outside the White House fence, hoping for that money shot, a photograph of the president's daughter, puffing away on the nation's most famous rooftop. She turned the act of smoking into performance art. At stuffy diplomatic receptions, she would stash her cigarettes and a matchbook inside her long white evening gloves. Then, in the middle of a tedious conversation, she would excuse herself, slip out onto a balcony, and when she returned a few minutes later, the faint, scandalous scent of tobacco would follow her like a rebellious perfume, causing the wives of senators to whisper and gasp behind their fans. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every cigarette was a perfectly executed piece of social theater, designed for maximum effect. Her defiance, however, wasn't limited to tobacco. She embraced another new, thrilling, and slightly terrifying invention of the age, the automobile. In an era when city streets were still dominated by the slow, predictable clop of horse-drawn carriages, the automobile was a noisy, smoke-belching symbol of raw power and speed. For a woman to be behind the wheel at all was a novelty. For a woman to drive with Alice's abandon was a national spectacle. She owned a sleek red convertible, a shocking color for a shocking vehicle, and she treated the streets of Washington, D.C. as her personal racetrack. She was famous for speeding, for weaving through traffic with her hair flying, often with a handsome young man clinging on for dear life in the passenger seat. The sight of her, young, beautiful, and in complete command of this powerful machine, entirely unchaperoned, was a potent symbol. It was a direct assault on the idea that women were delicate passengers in life, to be safely chauffeured by men. She was proving, one reckless drive at a time, that she intended to do the steering herself. But perhaps nothing captured her unique brand of joyful contempt for convention more than her unusual choice of pet. While other young ladies of society doted on fluffy lapdogs or purring kittens, Alice kept a garter snake. She named it Emily Spinach, a satirical tribute to her aunt, Emily Caro, whom Alice privately considered to be unpleasantly thin and dry. Emily Spinach was not a creature to be kept in a cage. It was her accomplice. Alice would carry the snake in her handbag or conceal it within a bouquet of flowers at the most formal of dinners. Imagine the scene, a state dinner in the White House. The tables are gleaming with polished silver and fine china. The conversation is a low hum of diplomatic pleasantries. And then, as the French ambassador is pontificating on foreign policy, a small green snake calmly slithers out from the centerpiece of roses. The result was predictable: shrieks, chaos, and occasionally a near-fainting spell. And through it all, Alice would sit there, feigning innocence with a look of pure, unadulterated delight in her eyes. For Alice, chaos was an art form, and boredom was her greatest enemy. Her rebellion also had a more reckless and costly edge. She became an avid gambler, a regular at the local horse tracks, where she would place bets with a bookie, an act almost unheard of for a woman of her class. More scandalously, she inserted herself into the high-stakes, smoke-filled poker games that were the exclusive domain of Washington's most powerful men. This was the ultimate old boys club, where senators, cabinet secretaries, and lobbyists made deals and traded secrets over whiskey and cards. Alice didn't just want an invitation, she demanded a seat at the table. The problem was her boldness at the poker table far outstripped her skill. She lost often, and she lost big. Her debts began to mount into the thousands of dollars, a staggering sum at the time. This wasn't just a private matter, it was a political liability. The thought of his daughter being financially indebted to the very politicians he had to negotiate with gave the president nightmares. On multiple occasions, Theodore Roosevelt had to quietly and angrily intervene. using his own money to settle her accounts. Each check he wrote was a silent admission of defeat. Yet to dismiss Alice's life in the White House as nothing more than a series of pranks and scandals would be a profound mistake. Beneath the rebellious exterior was a razor-sharp intellect and a keen, inherited understanding of politics. And her father, for all his frequent exasperation, recognized her value. She became one of his greatest social and diplomatic assets. Her charm could disarm his most bitter political enemies, and her immense celebrity brought a glamorous sheen to his often controversial administration. The pinnacle of her unofficial role as a diplomat came in 1905. President Roosevelt dispatched a massive delegation, led by Secretary of War William Howard Taft, on a crucial tour of Asia. The geopolitical stakes were high. The Russo-Japanese War had just concluded, and America was asserting its new role as a Pacific power. This was not a pleasure cruise, it was high-stakes diplomacy, and as his personal representative, the president sent his 21-year-old daughter. It was a masterstroke. Alice was the embodiment of a young, confident America. The trip was a stunning success, largely thanks to Ambassador Alice. She charmed the Empress of China, bantered with Japanese nobility, and was treated like visiting royalty everywhere she went. But even on the world stage, she could not be contained. On the long voyage across the Pacific, she created her own entertainment. She scandalized the stuffy older members of the delegation by instigating impromptu diving competitions, frequently jumping into the ship's swimming pool fully clothed. She learned to shoot a pistol from a friendly congressman and was often seen taking potshots at bottles tossed off the stern. She even goaded her future husband, Congressman Nicholas Longworth, into joining her for a secret midnight swim. Her behavior was a diplomat's nightmare, but a journalist's dream. The press followed her every move, and Alice's Log of the Far East became a national sensation back home. But beneath all the glamour, the fame, and the public acts of defiance, a more private, sadder story was unfolding. Alice's own diaries from the period reveal a young woman who often felt isolated and unhappy. She wrote of the dullness of official functions and the feeling of being trapped, constantly watched. As much as she seemed to be reveling in her boundless freedom, she felt like a prisoner of the White House. Every scandal, every rebellious act was a public performance, but it was also a private dialogue with the father she both adored and resented. She was testing his limits, begging for his attention, trying to force him to engage with her not as a national symbol, but as his daughter. And Theodore Roosevelt, the man who could command a nation, found himself utterly unable to command his own household. He made that famous remark to a friend in a moment of pure exasperation: "I can either run the country or I can attend to Alice, but I cannot possibly do both." His decision to run the country inadvertently allowed the legend of Princess Alice to grow beyond anyone's control. She had become a force of nature, a symbol of female rebellion, and a permanent headache for her father. But by 1905, her reign as the single first daughter was drawing to a close. Society, her father, and the Republican Party all agreed that it was time to find a man who could anchor her. It was time for Princess Alice to be married, to be settled in, as many hoped to finally be tamed. They were about to discover that no man ever could. Her marriage, like the rest of her life, would become just another stage for her deepest secrets and scandals. The hunt was on for a man who could not just win her hand, but somehow tame her indomitable spirit. Many suitors tried and failed. European nobles and American industrialist heirs were presented to her, but Alice found them all dreadfully dull. She needed a man who could match her wit, understand the game of politics, and who wouldn't be intimidated by the force of her personality. Then, into her orbit, came a man who seemed to fit the bill perfectly. His name was Nicholas Longworth, a Republican congressman from a wealthy and powerful Ohio family. He was suave, intelligent, and 14 years her senior. In him, Alice saw not a romantic soulmate, but a worthy sparring partner. A courtship began, but it was less a whirlwind romance and more a strategic negotiation. The engagement was announced, and the American public, which had followed Alice's every move with a mixture of adoration and shocked amusement, went into a collective frenzy. The untamable Princess Alice was finally to be wed. It was front-page news from New York to San Francisco. Society columnists debated every possible detail, while ordinary Americans felt as though a member of their own slightly madcap family was getting married. Her fiancé, the charming and worldly Congressman Nicholas Longworth, was seen as a man of substance and sophistication, perhaps the one man in America with the right combination of wit, political savvy, and sheer nerve to be a match for the president's daughter. Their courtship had been a distinctly Washingtonian affair, less a whirlwind of whispered sweet nothings and more a series of witty parries over dinner tables and strategic alliances forged in the political cross-currents of the capital. Alice was attracted not to a poet, but to a player in the great game she so loved. And so, on February 17, 1906, the nation got the wedding of the century. Washington, D.C. came to a standstill. From early morning, thousands of ordinary citizens, braving the winter chill, crowded the streets and parks surrounding the White House, hoping for just a glimpse of the bride or one of the famous guests. The atmosphere was electric, like a coronation and a national holiday rolled into one. Inside the executive mansion, the air was thick with the scent of thousands of lilies, roses, and orchids. The magnificent East Room, where the ceremony would take place, had been transformed into a floral wonderland, a verdant, blossoming stage for the day's main event. The Marine Band, in their dress scarlet uniforms, played softly as the most powerful people on the planet found their seats. The guest list was a staggering testament to the Roosevelt family's reach. The entire cabinet was there, led by the colossal figure of Secretary of War William Howard Taft. The black-robed justices of the Supreme Court were present, as were the leaders of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Foreign ambassadors, adorned in sashes and medals, mingled with industrial tycoons like the Guggenheims and the Morgans. It was a room so dense with power that, as one journalist wryly noted, a single well-aimed bomb would have decapitated the entire United States government. Then at the stroke of noon, the music swelled, and all eyes turned to the grand staircase. The President of the United States appeared, and on his arm was his daughter. A collective gasp swept through the room. Alice was a vision. She wore an impossibly beautiful gown of white satin with a bodice of delicate antique lace. Her dress shimmered with intricate silver embroidery, meant to evoke the orange blossoms of a traditional bride, but in her hands she carried not a demure bouquet, but a cascade of orchids. The gown flowed into a magnificent 18-foot train that pooled behind her like liquid moonlight. But it was what she didn't wear that made the boldest statement. She had flatly refused the traditional bridal veil, that soft, gauzy symbol of modesty and virginal purity. In its place, perched atop her elegantly coiffed hair, was a glittering diamond tiara. The message was unmistakable. A veil was for a woman being given away. A tiara was for a queen coming into her own. As Theodore Roosevelt walked his daughter down the aisle, the look on his face was a complex mixture of immense pride and perhaps profound relief. Here was the source of his greatest joy and his most public headaches, the living embodiment of his first tragic love, now being handed into the care of another man. He was not just the president. In that moment, he was a father, completing one of the most difficult and poignant duties of his life. The ceremony was brief but grand. Alice, for her part, was the picture of regal composure. There were no bridal jitters, no demure, downcast eyes. She stood tall, her voice clear and steady as she spoke her vows. She was not a nervous girl entering into the unknown. She was a star, and this was her greatest performance yet. After the vows were exchanged, the reception began, and the full staggering scale of the event became clear. The state gifts were put on display, a treasure trove that underscored Alice's status as America's de facto royalty. There were priceless silks and jade from the Dowager Empress of China, a rare mosaic from the Pope, antique tapestries from the King of England, and a jewel-encrusted box from the German Kaiser. The sheer opulence was breathtaking. The climax of the reception, however, was the cutting of the cake. It was an enormous multi-tiered confection, a masterpiece of the baker's art. A small, elegant silver knife was presented to the bride. Alice looked at the delicate instrument, and then at the massive cake, and a familiar mischievous glint appeared in her eye. She shook her head, a silent refusal. A moment of confused silence fell over the room. Then, a young military aide, who was in on the plan, stepped forward. He unbuckled his ceremonial sword from his belt, its hilt glittering under the chandeliers, and presented it to her. Alice took the weapon. It was a long, heavy cavalry saber, a symbol of military might and masculine power. She hoisted it up, her slender arms surprisingly steady, a warrior queen in white satin. The crowd gasped, then broke into laughter and applause. With a dramatic flourish, she plunged the point of the sword deep into the heart of the wedding cake. The message was loud, clear, and aimed at everyone in the room, perhaps most of all at her new husband. This was not a surrender. This was not a woman being domesticated. Marriage would not be the end of her rebellion. It would simply be the beginning of a new chapter of it. She was not being tamed. She was merely acquiring a new title and a new stage for her ongoing performance. This was Alice Roosevelt, remaking the institution of marriage in her own indomitable image, one shocking, brilliant, and unforgettable gesture at a time. On the surface, they were the ultimate power couple, a union of old money, political ambition, and unparalleled celebrity. The press adored them, and society saw them as the future of the Republican Party. But the gilded facade of the Longworth marriage began to crack almost before the wedding bells had stopped ringing. The grand European honeymoon, meant to be a celebration of their union, quickly devolved into a public display of their profound incompatibility. Nicholas Longworth, at his core, was a bon vivant, a man who adored fine wine, late-night card games, and above all, the attention of beautiful women. He was a creature of pleasure, not of power. Alice, on the other hand, was a creature of power who used pleasure as a tool. Stories from their honeymoon travels trickled back to Washington with alarming speed. At diplomatic functions in London and Paris, Nicholas was seen paying far more attention to other ladies than to his new bride, the famous daughter of the American president. He would disappear for hours, only to reappear with the faint scent of another woman's perfume clinging to his jacket. For Alice, this wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a deep and public humiliation. She was a Roosevelt. Her father was the most powerful man in the world, and she would not be made a fool of. Back in Washington, the behavior continued. Nicholas was a compulsive womanizer, and his indiscretions became a poorly kept secret in the capital's inner circles. While Alice hosted brilliant political salons, her husband was often across town, engaged in some tawdry affair. The humiliation burned, but Alice was a pragmatist, A divorce was simply unthinkable. It would create a catastrophic scandal that would not only tarnish her own reputation, but would also deeply wound her father during his presidency. It would mean exile, a loss of the social and political stage she had come to command. So, trapped in a gilded cage of a marriage, she made a cold, pragmatic, and utterly Alice-like decision. She would not play the part of the weeping, long-suffering wife. She would not leave her husband. She would simply beat him at his own game. If their marriage was to be an arrangement of convenience, a hollow partnership for public consumption, then she would use its shell to build a life of absolute personal and romantic freedom. And so began one of the most audacious and long-running secrets in American political history, Alice Roosevelt Longworth's secret life of love affairs. Washington, D.C. at the time operated on a strict, unspoken code. The city ran on secrets, and its elite society understood the rules of the game. A public scandal, the kind that made it into the newspapers, was ruinous. But private indiscretions, handled with skill and discretion, were often tolerated, especially among the powerful. It was a world of knowing glances, closed doors, and a collective agreement to look the other way. Alice didn't just learn the rules of this discreet world, she became its master. Her famous salon became the perfect cover. In her drawing room, under the guise of political debate, she could engage in electrifying flirtations and cultivate deep connections. She began to assemble what her intimate circle of friends knowingly referred to as her not-so-secret roster of lovers. These were not frivolous attachments. Alice was rarely interested in handsome but empty-headed young men. She was drawn to power, wit, and intellect. Her lovers were powerful senators, brilliant journalists, and charming foreign diplomats, men who could match her mind and were not intimidated by her spirit. She sought in these affairs the intellectual fire and emotional intensity that her own marriage so profoundly lacked. But among all these dalliances and flirtations, one relationship emerged that would eclipse all others, a connection so deep and enduring it would come to define her entire adult life. It was not a casual fling. It was a profound, decades-long love affair that would result in her life's greatest joy and its most devastating secret. The man who captured the heart of the woman who claimed not to have one was, in almost every conceivable way, her complete opposite. His name was William Borah, the senior senator from Idaho. Borah was a titan of the Senate, a political giant known as the Lion of Idaho. He was a rugged man from the West, a stark contrast to the East Coast aristocrats Alice grew up with. He was a staunch conservative Republican, a brilliant orator whose speeches could hold the Senate floor spellbound for hours, a deeply serious man, and a committed isolationist. He was intensely private, famously married, and possessed an aura of unshakable gravitas. On paper, he and the flamboyant, impulsive, and cosmopolitan Alice could not have been more different. But beneath the surface, they shared a powerful, almost magnetic connection. Borah was one of the few men in Washington who was not intimidated by Alice in the slightest. He didn't just tolerate her sharp intellect. He reveled in it. He was captivated by her political acumen, her deep knowledge of history, and her utterly fearless spirit. And Alice, for her part, found in Borah the one thing she had always craved and never found in her husband, an intellectual equal. Nicholas Longworth was a charming conversationalist. William Borah was a formidable mind. With Borah, Alice could debate foreign policy late into the night. She could dissect political strategy, analyze the weaknesses of their opponents, and share in the intricate, high-stakes game of power that was the lifeblood of the capital. Their relationship was a partnership of the mind as much as the heart, fueled by the friction of their opposing viewpoints and a deep mutual respect. Their affair began sometime around 1910 and would continue for the better part of 2 decades. It became Washington's ultimate open secret. Everyone in their elite inner circle knew, or at least strongly suspected. They would be seen taking long private walks through Rock Creek Park. During Alice's salon parties, the two of them would often disappear into her magnificent library for hours, ostensibly to discuss a piece of legislation. No one dared to interrupt. Their friends and colleagues entered into a silent conspiracy of protection. The press of the day, far more deferential to the private lives of public figures than it is today, never printed a word. The affair was hidden in plain sight, a testament to Alice's and Bora's cleverness and the unspoken code of their world. For years, this dangerous game continued. Then in 1924, an event occurred that threatened to blow their carefully constructed world apart. Alice, at the age of 40, after 18 years of a childless marriage, discovered she was pregnant. On February 14, 1925, the same cruel anniversary of her mother's death, Alice gave birth to a daughter. She named her Paulina. Officially, she was Paulina Longworth, but the child bore zero resemblance to Nicholas Longworth. Instead, she was the spitting image of the Lion of Idaho, Senator William Borah. The arrangement that followed was a masterpiece of social hypocrisy. Nicholas Longworth, facing a career-ending scandal, publicly claimed Paulina as his own, and by all accounts, grew to love her deeply. The Longworth home became a house built on a foundation of monumental lies. For Alice, it seemed like a victory. She had taken what she wanted from life, refusing to be constrained by a loveless marriage or the judgment of society. But this victory came at a terrible price. She had brought a child into a world of whispers and secrets, and the daughter born from it would ultimately pay the highest price for her mother's freedom. In April of 1931, Nicholas Longworth died suddenly of pneumonia. Alice, at 47, was a widow. The death of her husband did not mark an end for her. It marked a liberation. She was now completely untethered. She would not fade into the background. Instead, she would build an empire. Her grand house at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue became the most influential private salon in American history. An invitation to her home was the most coveted social prize in the capital. It was during this era that Alice fully weaponized her wit. She became the capital's resident oracle and its most feared critic. Her primary target was the new dynasty occupying the White House. Her own cousins, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor. Alice, a rock-ribbed Republican, viewed her Democratic cousins with a unique and personal contempt. Her attacks on them were relentless and legendary, a civil war within America's most famous political family. But while Alice was conquering the public world, her private world was crumbling under the weight of her life's greatest secret. The source of this decay was her daughter, Paulina. Growing up in a house where her mother's longtime lover was a constant presence and the man she called father was not her biological parent, was a psychological minefield. Paulina was a deeply troubled and fragile young woman, haunted by a profound melancholy and plagued by insecurities. To cope, she turned to alcohol and prescription pills. The tragedy reached its heartbreaking conclusion in 1957. Paulina, then just 31 years old, was found dead from an overdose of sleeping pills. The secret that had allowed Alice to live a life of defiant freedom had in the end become a death sentence for her child. The death of her daughter Paulina in 1957 was the great silent cataclysm of Alice Roosevelt Longworth's life. It did not mellow her in public. If anything, her wit grew even sharper, her armor even thicker, but it marked a definitive turn inward. Having outlived her husband, her lover, and now her only child, she became the matriarch of a family of ghosts. She poured her remaining maternal energy into raising her granddaughter, Joanna, yet another young girl brought up in the unconventional, emotionally complex world of 2009 Massachusetts Avenue. As the decades turned from the optimistic Camelot of the Kennedys to the turmoil of Vietnam and the cynicism of Watergate, Alice remained a constant. She was no longer a scandalous upstart or a political power broker. She had evolved into something else entirely, a living monument. She had outlived her contemporaries, her enemies, and even her own scandals, transforming them into the stuff of historical lore. Her salon continued, though it was a more sedate affair. The new generations of Washington's powerful still made the pilgrimage to her home, not just for the gossip, but for a connection to a past they had only read about in books. To sit in her drawing room was to sit with history itself. Her mind remained a steel trap, an encyclopedic archive of nearly a century of American secrets. She famously held on to her grudges, especially her friendship with Richard Nixon, which she dramatically severed after the Watergate scandal, calling him a liar and signaling to the rest of Washington that his time was up. Her 1933 memoir, Crowded Hours, had given the public a glimpse into her life, but it was a carefully curated performance, a masterpiece of omission. The book contained not a single word about the profound trauma of her mother's death, the emotional abandonment by her father, the deep unhappiness of her marriage, or the central drama of her life, her decades-long affair with William Borah, and the truth of her daughter's birth. It was her final act of narrative control. On February 20th, 1980, just 8 days after her 96th birthday, Alice Roosevelt Longworth died peacefully in her home. The hurricane was finally still. It was only after her death that the full truth of her life came to light, as historians confirmed the secret of Paulina's paternity. With the final piece of the puzzle in place, the question of her legacy can be fully addressed. And like the woman herself, it is profoundly complex and riddled with contradictions. There is a powerful case for her as a proto-feminist icon. In an age when women were expected to be silent and submissive, Alice was loud, brilliant, and utterly defiant. She lived the personal and sexual liberation that later generations of feminists would fight for. However, there is an equally compelling counter-argument. Her freedom was a product of immense privilege, and her quest for it came at a terrible cost to her daughter. Perhaps her most enduring legacy lies in a different realm altogether. Alice may have been one of the very first modern American celebrities. Long before the age of social media, she understood the mechanics of fame with an intuitive genius. She knew that scandal didn't have to be a liability. It could be an asset. She turned her life into a form of performance art, and in doing so, she wrote the playbook for a new kind of fame, where notoriety and influence were inextricably linked. In the end, Alice Roosevelt Longworth's life resists any easy label. She was a pioneer and a paradox, a hero of her own story, and in some ways, the villain of her daughter's. The title Washington's Other Monument was always meant as a witty compliment, a nod to her permanence and stature, but perhaps it's more accurate than anyone realized. Like the stone memorials that dot the city, she became a figure that everyone saw but few truly understood. Her life was a grand, brilliant, and often ruthless performance that lasted for 96 years, and the performance was so complete, so all-consuming, that it is impossible to know where the character of Princess Alice ended, and the real woman, the one who carried the weight of so much tragedy, truly began. She lived a life crowded with secrets, and perhaps the greatest secret of all was not who fathered her child, but who Alice Roosevelt Longworth, underneath it all, really was.